Hello, everyone. Imagine standing in a Muscogee town square in 1813. The ritual drum still beats, but news keeps arriving. New forts, new roads, old debts. At Fort Mims, a loose gate turns a summer noon into tragedy. At Tallapoosa, a log breastwork turns a river bend into a fortress. Tennessee militia, the 39th United States Infantry, and Cherokee Creek and Choctaw alleys move along red clay roads. Families choose between running to forts or staying to guard their corn. What decides fate first? The map or belief was the turning point, the log wall, or the treaty paper? Comment your view. I'm reading every reply. Autumn 1813. On the Tallapoosa and Alabama rivers, the Muscogee world split. Towns that had shared trade and ceremony now faced each other as enemies. The dates and places are fixed. July 1813. At Burnt Corn, a first sharp clash. August 1813 at Fort Mims, the deadliest blow on the frontier to that day. March 1814 at Horseshoe Bend at the town of Tallapoosa, the line breaks for good. The ground is river bends, pine ridges, and clay roads from Fort Strother and Fort Williams, down toward the Mobile and Tombigbee. The principal actors are clear. Upper Creek Red Stick leaders, including Manawa, Peter McQueen, and William Weatherford. Lower Creek leaders, including William McIntosh and allied headmen who sought protection and continuity within a changing order. United States forces under Andrew Jackson with Tennessee militia, the 39th United States Infantry, and a large body of allied Cherokee Creek and Choctaw warriors moving under their own leaders. Agents and traders link the towns through ledgers rations and long-standing debts. This conflict is both inside and along the border. It rises from arguments over law, land, and power within Muscogee society and meets the expansion of the United States across the southeast. Farms, mills, ferries, and roads press against fields and hunting paths. Agency rules challenge town authority. Spiritual renewal sharpens resistance in Upper Creek towns, while Lower Creek leaders try to hold space by treaty and alliance. The guiding question is direct. What forces inside Muscogee life and on its borders led to civil war in 1813, and why did the fighting through 1814 decide the political future of the Southeast? Winter 1811 set the prelude. Northern messengers reached Upper Creek towns after Tecumseh spoke at Tuckabashie in autumn 1811. The New Madrid shocks the same year seemed to confirm a call to purification and to restore warrior law. In 1796, the United States had appointed Benjamin Hawkins as agent. He urged Mills cattle pens and district police often called the Light Horse. His program favored headmen near agency storehouses along the Chattahoochee and Flint. Credit and annuities bound many Lower Creek families to these posts. In Upper Creek towns, elders warned that each new rule thinned old authority. A treaty line history framed every council. The Treaty of New York 1790 promised boundaries yet opened a door for future cessions under pressure. The Treaty of Coleraine 1796 adjusted trade supervision through federal agents. The Treaty of Fort Wilkinson 1802 and the Treaty of Washington 1805 cut additional belts from Muscogee claim to secure roads across Georgia toward the Tombigbee. Each cession aimed to settle a crisis of debt or violence. Each cession sharpened mistrust inside the nation. By 1810, deerskin prices had fallen. Store ledgers carried balances that could not be cleared with hunts alone. Merchants tightened terms. Powder and ball now moved as favors through agency channels. Policy shifts set the stage. War Department agents managed Indian affairs in the southeast. They pressed fixed farms, ferries, and written police. Mission teachers began small schools in select towns. For many leaders, these programs promised stability within a shrinking world. For Red Stick preachers and warriors, they marked a slide into dependency and the loss of town courts. Fact and folklore meet here. Spiritual renewal was real and deep. Material grievance and land loss were just as real. Together they made a movement. Immediate triggers came in quick order. In spring 1813, Red Stick parties moved toward Pensacola to collect powder from a Spanish post. On 1813-07-27, Alabama militia struck a returning party at Burnt Corn. The fight ended with scattered loads on the trail and a vow to answer. On 1813-08-30, a large Red Stick force attacked Fort Mims on the Tensaw. Hundreds died. The shock emptied cabins along the Mobile and Tombigbee and pulled militia and volunteers into forts. United States commanders judged that only a hard campaign could break the threat. Objectives diverged. Red Stick leaders sought to cleanse towns of corrupt practice and to halt further land loss. They intended to punish enemies within and to drive forts and roads back across the line. Lower Creek headmen intended to save their families and fields by alliance. They looked to agency distributions and to treaty standing for protection. United States authorities intended to pacify the frontier and to secure a continuous corridor from Georgia to the Gulf. Allied Cherokee and Choctaw communities carried their own aims, shaped by recent raids and border friction. They sought to stop Red Stick attacks and to affirm their place with the United States without surrendering identity. Constraints were severe. Red Stick bands held courage interior tracks and river knowledge. They lacked steady powder and suffered when cornfields went untended. Lower Creek families were split by kinship ties to both camps and risked reprisal. United States militia mustered fast, but enlistments ran short, and fever cut ranks in summer and autumn. The 39th United States Infantry provided a trained corps yet marched on thin rations. Wagons bogged on clay roads between Fort Deposit Fort Strother and Fort Williams. Pack horses failed for lack of forage. Drovers tried to push lean cattle south, while Red Stick scouts harried the lines. Logistics snapshots mark the realities. Messages moved by couriers along the Coosa and Tallapoosa. A letter could take days from Fort Strother to the Talladega line. Powder issued from Mobile and from the Tennessee Trace arrived late and in small lots. Meal rations dropped to half at times. Cornfields inside Muscogee country were burned in raids by both sides. Refugee families built brush shelters near friendly forts. Blacksmiths in column tried to keep gunlocks working with scraps and wire. Allied warriors guided crossings and found fords where swollen creeks blocked wheels. Through late 1813, pressure rose with each march order. Jackson pushed roads forward from the Tennessee line to Fort Strother. Detachments struck Tallushatchee and lifted the siege at Talladega in November. In the same month, the towns of Odyssey and Tallahassee fell to fire. These blows destroyed supplies but did not end the war. Red Stick leaders pulled people and food toward a prepared bend on the Tallapoosa, where a log breastwork faced the neck of land. They meant to force a single decision and to prove that town medicine and resolve could blunt the United States column. By early 1814, the causes were set in hard lines. Decades of sessions and agency rules had split authority. A spiritual and political revival had hardened into war. Frontier panic had produced a large coalition under United States command. The question that remained was whether Red Stick courage and earthworks at a river bend could offset hunger expiring enlistments and the slow grind of roads, forts, and Allied numbers. The next march would answer it. Late summer 1813 set families moving along the Alabama and Tombigbee. The first hard incident was on the trail called Burnt Corn on 1813 to 07-27. A Red Stick provisioning party, returning from Pensacola with powder and lead, moved through pine uplands under storm heat. Scouts from Alabama militia and volunteers closed from the flanks and struck at the pack train. The fight scattered loads across sand and wiregrass. Red Stick rear guards rallied and pushed the attackers off the ground by dusk. The immediate effect was to harden resolve in Upper Creek towns and to confirm the need to concentrate people and stores away from open roads. Couriers carried news by night from the Florida line north to towns on the Tallapoosa. Interpreters repeated the accounts in council squares, where elders weighed the meaning of the ambush. There was no telegraph to compress the distance. Each message took hours or days depending on river crossings and swollen creeks after sudden rains. 34 days later, the pressure rose to a level the entire frontier could not ignore. On 1813-0830, a large Red Stick force descended on Fort Mims near the Tensaw. The season was late summer and the air heavy. The palisade held a mixed population of militia families, free people of color, and enslaved people along with traders and agents. A neglected gate and confusion at noon gave the attackers a gap. The fight ran house to house and into the open yard. By the time smoke thinned, hundreds were dead. The shock moved faster than any courier. Refugees who had escaped on the river spread the word through Tensaw settlements down to Mobile. Across Lower Creek towns, the news split councils. Some headmen called for open alliance with United States posts to avoid a general punishment. Others warned that throwing in with the United States would invite reprisals from kin among the Upper Creeks. Panic emptied cabins along the Tombigbee. Families gathered at small palisaded stations where rations ran thin. United States officers at Mobile and along the Mississippi Delta forwarded urgent letters upriver. The lack of a central line of communication meant overlapping orders and delays as commands and militia tried to sort rank and march dates. In September and October, small fights and seizures multiplied. Red Stick parties struck isolated cabins near the Mobile Delta and along side creeks of the Alabama. Lower Creek guides led militia patrols to smoke columns and then home again when supplies ran out. The weather turned to autumn rain. Trails churned to clay. Wagons could not keep pace with mounted detachments, so cattle were driven on the hoof and often lost in night confusion. Interpreters had to be found for each parley and sometimes could not be spared from escorting refugees. This friction created gaps in which rumors bloomed. Reports of British muskets in large numbers passed from station to station, though only small lots moved through the Gulf. The effect was the same. Territorial commanders argued that only a strong column with regular infantry could break the run of raids and siege attempts. By early November, Andrew Jackson marched south from the Tennessee line, with Tennessee militia regulars of the 39th United States Infantry and allied Cherokee under their own leaders. The first set-piece incident in this phase came at Tallashatchee on 1813-11-03. Jackson detached John Coffee with mounted riflemen and allied warriors to strike the town on the Coosa side. The morning was cold and clear. The detachment encircled the houses and pressed in with rifle and fire. The town fell. The immediate effect was to show that the new column could reach interior towns. It also created non-combatant flight. Women and children moved toward other Upper Creek settlements, and food stores began to concentrate at interior locations away from the Coosa corridor. Only days later, a plea reached Jackson from Friendly Creek at Talladega under siege. The courier rode through wet bottomland to Fort Strother, where Jackson had centered his supply. On 1813-11-09, Jackson moved at speed. At Talladega, his line broke the circle and pulled Allied families free. The rescue steadied the alliance and showed Lower Creek headmen that cooperation could bring immediate security. It also fixed Jackson to the ground. His men were already near the end of enlistments. Meal rations were short. Drovers tried to bring thin cattle forward, but Red Stick scouts cut stragglers along creek crossings. A network of small forts and depots was now essential to hold any gains. A short letter from the field captures the strain and the pace without comfort. John Coffee, letter, camp, near Talladega, 1813-11-10. The enemy yielded the ground. At last light. Our losses are not light. We want meal, and a day more would have forced us back, but the friends within are relieved, and we move again with what we have. The column did move again. On 1813-11-29, Jackson led a coordinated strike against Odyssey and Tallahassee on the Tallapoosa. The morning was frosted. Allied warriors crossed side channels in cold water and seized canoes. Houses burned as defenders fell back through smoke. The seizure destroyed corn and storage pits that the Red Stick movement needed for winter. The immediate effect was hunger that reached into January. Yet even success showed limits. Militia enlistments ran out in December. Many men went home. Disease thinned ranks at Fort Strother and along the road to Fort Williams. Jackson reported half rations and the need for the 39th United States Infantry to steady future assaults. Signals lagged again. Orders to rendezvous sometimes reached detachments days late. A wagon train missed a turn near Shoal Creek and lost a week. Meanwhile, Red Stick families and fighters concentrated around a prepared position at a bend of the Tallapoosa, where the river itself formed three sides of a wall. While Jackson operated along the Coosa and Tallapoosa, another incident shaped the southern arc of the war. On 1813-12-23, near a place later called Holy Ground on the Alabama, a column under Ferdinand Claiborne engaged a Red Stick town with spiritual importance. The ground was sandy pine and the air sharp. The defenders contested the approach, but the town was overrun and burned. This blow cut another source of food and further pushed survivors toward interior strongholds and toward Spanish lines near Pensacola. The same day and week saw additional seizures of small boats and powder alongside creeks. Each success removed stores the Red Stick towns could not quickly replace. Through early winter, the pressure rose on both sides. Refugees gathered under United States protection at small posts where interpreters and clerks tried to count families for ration lists. Corn was issued in handfuls. At the same time, bands from Upper Creek towns probed the edges of forts and seized droves when they could. The weather alternated between cold, clear days and soaking rain that ruined powder. Blacksmiths in camp repaired gunlocks with wire and scrap. Couriers carried the same few messages back and forth along the Coosa and Tallapoosa. Every delay magnified the risk that a siege could form around a friendly town before help arrived. By January 1814, the pattern of incidents produced a new map of risk. Upper Creek Red Stick leaders held a fortified position at Tohopeka within a bend of the Tallapoosa and sent scouts to watch all approaches. Lower Creek families gravitated toward forts that could answer a call for help within 2 or 3 days of riding. United States commanders linked Fort Strother and Fort Williams with cut roads and small depots and waited on the 39th United States Infantry to close ranks for a main assault. The incidents at Burnt Corn and Fort Mims had set the war's emotional temperature. The rescues and burnings in November had set the calendar of supply and enlistment. The December strike at Holy Ground and the winter raids set the hunger that would force choices in March. Signals still crawled on horseback. Weather still opened and closed trails. The The next act would be decided where rivers narrowed and a breastwork turned a peninsula into a wall. The order of battle formed as winter loosened its grip. Andrew Jackson held command of a mixed column built around the 39th United States Infantry, supported by Tennessee militia and volunteers. Allied warriors from Cherokee and Creek towns moved under their own leaders. John Coffey led mounted riflemen on the left. The right and center placed militia with the regulars as the spine. Supply ran forward from Fort Strother to Fort Williams on cut roads and muddy traces. The enemy held a fortified town called Tohopeka on a peninsula within a bend of the Tallapoosa. A heavy log breastwork spanned the neck of land. The river walled the other sides in deep green water. The march began in late March 1814. From Fort Williams, the column stepped off before dawn on 1814-03-27. Terrain was red clay pine ridge and oak flat. Creeks crossed the road in cold runs that soaked shoes and ruined poor powder. Pack horses carried meal and a ration of beef on the hoof. Cattle were thin from winter. A small train of wagons creaked under flour and spare musket parts. The choke point was the bend itself, a single approach by land at the neck, water everywhere else. Jackson's rules of engagement were plain: strike the armed enemy, restrain men from pillage, protect non-combatants brought under guard, take prisoners when quarter is asked. Orders set guards for the cattle and ammunition mules. Guides from Allied towns marked fords and side paths. Couriers carried short notes between the head of column and Coffey's detached wing. First contact came in the river thickets below the bend. Coffey had crossed with mounted men and Allied warriors by mid-morning on the 27th. Canoes were seized from the far bank, shots cracked from the town. Smoke rose as cabins caught fire where the attackers reached the rear rows. The movement behind the breastwork drew defenders to the water's edge. They fired across the channel at men in canoes and at swimmers towing seized boats by ropes in their teeth. At the neck, Jackson formed the line. The 39th United States Infantry took the center with militia aligned on either side. Allied Creek and Cherokee skirmishers moved forward in the brush. The breastwork was built of heavy timbers angled to catch and shed balls. It stood chest high with loopholes cut at measured spaces. The first volleys rolled along the line at short range. Splinters jumped from the works. Men on both sides went down. The assault paused as officers dressed ranks and pushed ammunition forward. Runners moved cartouche boxes along the files. The sun climbed and heat rose off the red earth. The order to close went through the center. The regulars fixed bayonets and pressed into the angle of the works, while militia kept up fire to left and right. Allied skirmishers pushed at gaps as smoke from the burning rear streets drifted through the bend. Fighting turned hand to hand at the loopholes. Men climbed the logs and dropped inside. The works were entered in sections. Once inside the town, the battle became a scatter of close fights among cabins and lanes. Some defenders took to the water rather than yield. Others moved to clumps of trees that still stood and fired until overrun. Casualty ranges come from returns and after-action letters. Red Stick dead were reported above 500 within the bend. Some later counts place the number higher, but the lower figure is supported by near-field burials and officer tallies. United States and Allied losses were reported at roughly 50 killed and more than 100 wounded, with the 39th United States Infantry bearing a corps share. The numbers mark the weight of the fight, but the ground tells the rest. The breastwork fell to a push from the front, combined with the attack from the rear. Neither action alone explains the break. A short field order captured the sequence at the neck and the duty after the breach. Andrew Jackson Field Order Camp at the Bend, 1914-03-27. Press the work in front, hold the flanks tight, secure. The river canoes gather prisoners and remove the wounded of every party to Fort Williams without delay. An after-action line from the riverbank set the tone for the pursuit and restraint that followed. John Coffey, after-action note, MAMP across Tallapoosa, 1914-03-28. Many took to the water. We called for quarter, where it was asked our men ferried women and children across and placed them under guard. The wounded of all sides are being carried out. Non-combatants paid a heavy price when fire ran through the town. Houses held food stores and families together. In the confusion, some were shot in flight along the bank. Others were shielded by Allied warriors and soldiers and brought under guard. A group of captives was moved to the rear with escorts assigned by name. Lists were started for distribution of rations at Fort Williams. A small field hospital was set under canvas with surgeons from the regulars and militia working by lamplight. The river provided water. Bark and cloth served as dressings when lint ran out. Logistics remained a stress throughout the action and in the days after. Ammunition wagons had fallen behind at a narrow crossing and had to be hauled forward by double teams. Meal rations dropped to half the day before the attack. Cattle strayed in the noise and were rounded after. Farriers reshod 4 dozen horses with recycled iron. A storm line the next night soaked tents and threatened to ruin remaining cartridges. Guards were set over powder kegs in dry wagons. Blacksmiths repaired bayonet sockets bent in the assault. The column used the captured canoes to move wounded across the river and to search for any who had drifted to eddies below the bend. Maneuvers after the breach followed a simple plan. Details burned remaining stores that could not be carried. Scouts swept the woods east of the bend and along the river bends toward Talladega trails. A parley flag answered any who sought terms. William Weatherford and others later came in to speak under protection. Jackson kept the main body at the bend long enough to bury the dead and to collect arms. Then he turned the column back toward Fort Williams to reorganize for further marches to the Alabama and to posts that would receive surrendering bands. Humanitarian outcomes reflected the mixed nature of the force. Allied Cherokee and Creek headmen took custody of many captives to protect them and to prevent revenge killing. United States officers issued orders against ill treatment and set guards on pens where prisoners waited for removal. Rations were counted out by handfuls. Children were moved closest to the wagons at night. The wounded of every party lay in rows under rough shelters. Surgeons recorded amputations and fevers. Chaplains and interpreters moved among the rows with water and short prayers. Fact and folklore must be kept separate on several key points. Some later stories held that the breastwork could not be carried from the front, and that victory came only from the river attack. Records and ground study do not support a single cause. The frontal push by regulars with bayonets combined with pressure from the rear to fracture defense. Other tales claim that all defenders were slain without quarter. Returns and letters record women and children taken under guard, and men granted quarter when they asked. At the same time, losses among men who tried to swim the river were very high, and many died in the water. Rules of discipline carried through the day after. Plundering was punished in ranks. A sergeant was put under arrest for taking a blanket from a captive. A private was flogged for drunkenness at the spring. Officers detailed parties to collect stray cattle and to drive them back to the line. Ration issues were resumed at Fort Williams, with beans and meal tallied by company and by Allied band. Powder was dried on cloth in the sun when the weather cleared. By April, the campaign phase shifted from set battle to pursuit and consolidation. Small bands fled south toward the Alabama and west toward the Talladega Hills. Allied scouts tracked smoke and foot sign, but the need to guard prisoners and to nurse the wounded slowed every movement. The column sent messages to posts along the Tombigbee and to Mobile for additional medical stores and shoes. A count of serviceable muskets in the 39th United States Infantry showed several dozen in need of repair from split stocks and sprung pins. Farriers rebuilt hoofs worn to shell on the red clay. The river crossing sites were marked on rough maps for future patrols. The confrontation at the bend ended the Red Stick ability to hold ground and strength. It did not end hunger or grief. The breach at the breastwork broke a military position. The treaty to come would fix the political result. In the plain prose of the returns, the day at Tohopeka reads as a hard fight won by coordinated assault with Allied help under strained supply. In the memory of families, it reads as fire smoke and loss on a river that once marked seasons and now marked a line that could not be crossed. The turning came in two linked moments set months apart on the same river map. The first was the breach at Tohopeka on 1814-03-27 at the bend of the Tallapoosa. The second was the treaty drawn at Fort Jackson on 1814-08-09 on the Coosa and Alabama line. Together they shifted initiative and then fixed a political order that outlasted the smoke of the fight. At Horseshoe Bend, the objective on the United States side was narrow and concrete: break the breastwork, seize or scatter the Red Stick Corps, and end the capacity to hold ground. Constraints were severe. Ammunition trains lagged on bad roads. Meal and beef were short. Enlistments neared expiry. Weather swung from chill morning to heat under a clear sky, and a storm threatened the next night. Orders held the line to discipline and demanded protection of non-combatants. On the Red Stick side, the objective was to prove that a fortified town medicine and courage could blunt the column and break Allied confidence. Constraints were sharper. Powder was limited. Food stores within the bend were finite. Families shared the same space as defenders. Escape routes were water or a single neck of land under fire. The immediate effect of the breach was a transfer of initiative. After the works fell and the town burned in sections, the Red Stick movement lost the ability to gather large forces in the open. Surviving bands scattered along wooded ridges or moved toward Spanish lines near Pensacola. Some leaders, including William Weatherford, sought terms in the weeks after. Others continued small war, but without a center to hold ground. United States columns no longer feared a pitched fight in timber. They feared sickness and supply more than a massed counterattack. Allied towns that had chosen the United States side saw proof that relief could arrive and pressed their claims for protection. The field pivot did not settle the larger question. That came with the paper line. At Fort Jackson in late summer, the treaty demanded a vast cession from Muscogee claim. The scope reached across tracts held by those who had fought the Red Sticks and those who had fought against them. The official objective stated security and the opening of roads and posts. The constraint for Muscogee leaders was that the winter of 1813 to 1814 had destroyed crops and scattered families. Powder and corn were low. The Red Stick Corps was broken. There was no longer a military position from which to bargain. An admission against interest from the victorious side shows the breadth of that choice. United States Officer Memorandum Maj Milledgeville, 1915-01-20. We have taken from the friendly as well as the hostile towns, and by this very breadth ensure tranquility, though it sits ill with those who aided us. The evidence on the ground fixes names and wounds to the moment of turn. Menawa, a principal Red Stick, was wounded many times in the fight and escaped through the river woods at dusk. John Coffey's reports note Allied warriors pulling children out of burning cabins. The 39th United States Infantry carried the center and left dozens of men on surgeon rolls. Among the Tennessee officers, a young Sam Houston took wounds in the assault and lived a mark that later tied national memory to this bend. The human cost ran beyond the lists. Families from both upper and lower towns buried kin along the river and then walked under guard or in small bands along trails toward safety that winter. The displacement path traced from Tallapoosa villages to forts on the Coosa, and then down to agency posts with some bands pushing south toward the Alabama and west toward the Talladega Hills. In later years, winter count-style records, ledgers, and family stories paired Fort Mims and Tohopeka as two fixed points of loss. Counterfactual lines must rest on records. If ammunition had failed at the neck on 1814-03-27 and the 39th United States Infantry had been forced back Jackson's militia ranks near expiry, might have compelled a withdrawal to Fort Williams and a delay of weeks. If the British had landed powder and arms in large lots through Pensacola in early spring, Red Stick magazines might have lasted long enough to support a second stand-up river. Yet the structural forces set in P2 argue that even with delay, the coalition under United States command possessed roads, forts, and Allied numbers that would have reopened the march once supplies recovered. The civil split inside Muscogee society meant that Red Stick leaders could not draw on unified depth in food and carriers. The Red Stick strategy depended on one decisive defense in a shrinking circle of resources. The treaty's turn linked back to the same structural pressures. Decades of cessions and agency rules had created town factions over annuities and authority. The deerskin market collapse and debt tied Lower Creek leaders to store credit and roads. Spiritual renewal in upper towns fused grievance and identity into a movement that could fight but could not feed a long war. The frontier panic after Fort Mims created a United States coalition that would accept heavy costs to end raids. Horseshoe Bend cut the military knot. Fort Jackson pulled the line tight across land and rivers. The result was a new map that opened the southeast to roads and cotton fields while compressing Muscogee space and authority. Weather marked both moments. A clear March sky and a cold river hardened the fight at the bend. A fever season and summer heat hung over councils at Fort Jackson. Orders and returns speak in short lines. They add up to a turn that changed who could move where and under what law. After the treaty, United States posts controlled crossings and ferries. Agency distributions and arrests followed new schedules. For Muscogee families, the turn meant rebuilding on reduced ground or leaving old fields entirely. For Allied nations who fought at the bend, it meant a complicated credit in United States eyes and a longer argument about what protection should earn. The turning point, therefore, was not a single shot or a single signature. It was a linked sequence in which a town fell and then a map followed. The battle proved that the Red Stick Corps could be broken. The treaty ensured that even those who had stood with the United States would pay for the war in land. In that sequence, the structural forces from P2 land pressure agency policy, factional politics, and fragile logistics reassembled into a new order that set paths for removal settlement and the hard continuance of culture under constraint. Law and administration changed first and fastest. In the months after the bend, United States officers gathered depositions and compiled arrest lists for men blamed for the killings at Fort Mims and other raids. Transfers of prisoners moved from posts on the Coosa and Tallapoosa to Mobile by boat and wagon. Some trials proceeded under territorial courts with mixed juries, while others resolved under military authority when witnesses could not be kept in place. The Treaty of Fort Jackson 1814 set a boundary that removed a vast belt of Muscogee claim and placed forts, ferries, and roads under United States control. Annuities and rations were henceforward to be issued at agency posts along those roads. Agent letters by Benjamin Hawkins from his final years, copied into War Department files, describe the shift in distributions and the appointment of local light horse to police ration lines. Jackson dispatches from Fort Williams and later from Mobile record standing orders that non-combatants brought in under flag should be protected and placed on ration lists until families could replant. Returns of the 39th United States Infantry for spring 1814 list escorts assigned to prisoner columns and the names of surgeons sent with the wounded back to the forts. The treaty text and the agent rolls together show how law and food moved in the same direction after the fighting ceased. Reservation in the modern sense did not follow at once. Instead, the treaty line created a reduced interior where Allied Lower Creek towns tried to rebuild with the understanding that further treaties would refine the map. Agency memoranda in 1815 and 1816 speak of provisional districts for planting and hunting and of permission slips to cross ferries with cattle. School placements began on a small scale. Mission and agency reports from the late 1810s list a handful of pupils at select towns learning letters and farm routines alongside language instruction, with interpreters hired to mediate lessons. Across the next generation, new treaties and acts shifted administration again. The treaty made at Cassetta in 1832 reorganized land into individual selections under survey a policy that officials promised would secure families, but that in practice opened the door to speculators. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 and military orders issued in 1836 led to forced removals west for thousands of Muscogee people. Removal rolls from 1836 to 1837 record family groups by name and age on the road to the west along river and wagon routes under contract transport. Land and resource use followed the lines set on paper. Surveyors ran chains across pine and prairie. Leases for ferries, mills, and landings multiplied. Cotton culture expanded along the Black Belt soils between the Alabama and Tombigbee. Shipping manifests from Mobile list bales moving downriver in the seasons after 1815. Grazing leases appear in county ledgers by the 1820s, where open range met new fence law. Later came rail spurs that tied upland towns to river ports. County court orders fixed access rights to crossings and timber stands. For Muscogee families who remained inside the reduced line, the effect was immediate restriction. Agency permits governed where cattle could graze and when a boat could use a landing. For those forced west after 1836, land policy turned to allotment a generation later. The Dawes Commission rolls of 1898 to 1907 counted citizens of the Muscogee Nation in Indian Territory by household and parcel, reducing communal control and setting the conditions for loss of land through tax sales and fraud. Demography and health tell the cost more quietly than battle returns. Agent censuses in 1815 and 1816 show Lower Creek towns under half their pre-war counts and long lists of widows and orphans added to ration books. Surgeon reports from the posts list measles among children and fevers among men weakened by winter marches and poor diet. Burial notes appear in chaplain diaries for spring 1814 through autumn, marked only by river name and a mile count from a fort. Birth numbers sagged for several years, then recovered unevenly, a pattern that repeats in agency summaries through the 1820s. Removal rosters record deaths on the road, and births recorded only as infant male or infant female when a name could not yet be entered. Later territorial and federal census tables in the West show clustered settlements along new agency roads where water and mills could be found. Cultural continuance never stopped. Ceremony adapted to new distances between towns and to the need to travel under passes issued by agents. Green corn rights resumed in guarded fashion, where fields survived. Language moved with families to forts for rations and then west along the removal roads. Interpreters wrote word lists in school reports, while elders kept teaching by practice. Warrior societies that had split in the Civil War slowly resumed shared hunts where permission could be obtained. Ledger-style art arm and winter count memory placed the Bend as a mark, alongside the earlier shock of Fort Mims, two stations that bound the story of loss and survival. Later community commemorations at the River Bend and at agency sites tied names to places, again often with both strands present in speeches Red Stick and Lower Creek, without dissolving the difference. Memory also formed in the papers of allies and adversaries. Jackson's general orders and after-action letters became part of the national story that raised him to higher command. John Coffey's letters kept by family and later copied preserved the acknowledgement that Allied Cherokee and Creek warriors ferried children from burning houses. The treaty text of 1814 stands beside a later admission in officer memoranda that land was taken from those who had fought with the United States as well as from those who fought against it. Those paired records explain why later Muscogee petitions in the 1820s and 1830s argue for protection that had been promised and then thinned by survey and sale. The petitions survive in War Department files next to routine lists of ration corn and iron hose. Present-day continuance is visible and recorded. The Muscogee Nation, centered in Oklahoma, maintains constitutional government courts, language revitalization programs, and cultural events. Its governance and enrollment stand on the same sequence of records that once narrowed space roles and treaties and court decisions now use to affirm modern jurisdiction. The Porch Band of Creek Indians maintains federal recognition in Alabama, with community programs, economic enterprises, and a museum presence near Atmore. Federal notices from the early 1980s record the formal acknowledgement of that status after decades of local continuance. Commemorative parks and interpretive centers at the river bend and along old road traces provide space for education and ceremony. School curricula and tribal education departments teach language and history to new generations. Elders tell the winter stories and the removal stories together so that the bend on the Tallapoosa is not only a mark of defeat, but also a starting point for names that endure. 5 kinds of records frame this aftermath in prose. The Treaty of Fort Jackson text fixes the land cession and the first post-war boundary. War Department correspondence holds Benjamin Hawkins' late letters and the orders and returns from 1814 that set ration and arrest policy. Territorial court dockets and deposition bundles in Alabama and Georgia document individual trials and transfers. Removal rolls from 1836 to 1837, and the Dawes Commission rolls from 1898 to 1907 count families on the road and later in allotment. Mission and agency school reports from the 1810s through the 1880s record the early placements of pupils and the use of interpreters and primers. Together they support the through line of law, land, health, culture, and memory from the months after the bend to the present day. The continuance of Muscogee life does not erase the costs set by the war and the paper line that followed it, yet the same records that mark loss also record adaptation. Ceremony took new form. Language changed place and kept its sound. Families rebuilt within reduced ground or in the West under new rules. In that work, the aftermath is not an ending, but a reordering that still shapes the map of law and the calendar of community events. And that still sends people back to riverbanks and agency houses where names were once counted and are now spoken again. Across 2 centuries, the Scholarly Center holds on several conclusions. First, the Creek Civil War of 1813 and 1814 was not a brief frontier disturbance, but a decisive restructuring of Muscogee political life under external pressure. The internal split between Upper Creek Red Stick towns and Lower Creek allies predated the open fighting, yet the campaign along the Tallapoosa and Alabama converted faction into a new order fixed by treaty. Second Horseshoe Bend did more than end a field army. It created the leverage for the Treaty of Fort Jackson, whose breadth removed land from both hostile and friendly towns and opened a continuous corridor for United States settlement from Georgia to the Gulf. Third, the episode accelerated national trajectories. Andrew Jackson's command reputation rose from this theater to later wars and politics, while the treaty logic here foreshadowed policy patterns that culminated in removal across the Southeast. Important points remain contested. Counts of Red Stick dead at the bend vary across returns and later tallies, with modern readings emphasizing the limits of battlefield enumeration amid burning structures and river drownings. The weight of spiritual revival versus material grievance inside the Red Stick mobilization is debated, with some historians foregrounding prophetic authority and others stressing debt trade collapse and session fatigue. Responsibility for the scope of the Fort Jackson session divides interpretation. One view holds that broad seizure was the only durable guarantee of frontier security after Fort Mims. A counter-view argues that confiscating land from Allied towns betrayed promises made in the field and transformed a civil conflict into a general dispossession. Individual roles are also reevaluated. Manawa's survival and later statements, Weatherford's parley, and the actions of Lower Creek and Allied Cherokee and Choctaw leaders are read against shifting local aims rather than simple categories of loyalty or betrayal. The enduring legacy works on 3 planes. As doctrine, it normalized security through expansive cession, a template applied in later southeastern treaties and then hardened by removal policy. As reform stimulus, it prompted the expansion of forts roads and administrative instruments that bound annuities, schools, and police to federal schedules. As symbol, it remains a paired memory within Muscogee communities and among neighbors, with Fort Mims and Horseshoe Bend, marking a before and after, and with present-day commemorations at river bends and agency sites asserting continuance as much as loss. The episode also endures as a case study in coalition warfare among Native nations, where Allied participation was real motivated and consequential, and where its rewards and costs remained contested for generations. The Creek Civil War endures in memory because it shows on one compact map how a Native nation's internal struggle met an expanding republic, how a battle and a treaty together redrew the land, and how culture survived within the new lines. This is not only a story of military victory, it is a story of land-taken families scattered, and Muscogee culture continuing anyway. If you were in the position of the leaders at the time, would you keep fighting or sign a treaty to keep your people alive? Why? Comment your choice and one question you want us to cover next. Thank you for watching.